I am Stella, 34 years old, and the night I supposedly lost my job was the exact moment my family decided to throw me out on the street. My father threw an empty suitcase at my feet, declaring my sister needed my bedroom more than I did. My sister did not offer sympathy. She just screamed about who would pay her car loan now that I was a useless burden. My mother stood right beside them, nodding in agreement. I said absolutely nothing about the multi-million-dollar company registered in my name or the oceanfront beach house waiting for me down the coast. Hours later, they would realize they had just evicted the only person keeping them from utter ruin. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who completely underestimated your worth. The heavy oak doors of our Atherton mansion closed behind me, shutting out the relentless California rain. I stood in the foyer, dripping wet, holding my damp tote bag. The house smelled of expensive candles and roasted dinner, a stark contrast to the exhausting day I had just endured. I walked into the main living room where my father William and my mother Caroline were sipping wine by the fireplace. My younger sister Naomi sat on the plush velvet sofa next to her husband Andre. I took a deep breath and announced that my company had just been acquired. I told them my position as a data analyst had been eliminated. I was officially unemployed. I expected a brief moment of shock or compassion, maybe a sympathetic pat on the shoulder. Instead, the room went dead silent. William set his crystal wine glass down on the mahogany side table. He stood up slowly, walked past me into the hallway closet, and returned carrying an old scuffed suitcase. Without a single word of comfort, he threw the empty luggage directly at my feet. The metallic zipper clattered against the hardwood floor. "Pack your things, Stella," he ordered, his voice devoid of any parental warmth. "You are leaving this house tonight." I stared at the suitcase, my mind struggling to process the sudden hostility. I asked him exactly what he meant. Caroline stood up, smoothing the front of her blouse, her expression as hard as stone. "Naomi and Andre are expecting a baby," she announced coldly. "They need to start preparing a nursery. Your master suite is the only logical choice for their growing family. Since you are now unemployed, you have become a financial burden to this household. We simply cannot afford to subsidize a useless freeloader. You need to vacate the premises immediately." I looked at my mother, searching for a trace of a joke, but her face was deadly serious. I reminded them that the weather outside was terrible, and it was already past 8 in the evening. I asked for just one single night to figure out my next steps. Caroline immediately crossed her arms and shook her head. "Real life does not wait for the rain to stop, Stella," she snapped. "You are 34 years old. It is time you face the consequences of your mediocre career choices." I turned my silent gaze to my sister, the golden child who had never worked a hard day in her life. Naomi was 30 years old, yet she still expected the world to be handed to her on a silver platter. I thought she might intervene, perhaps suggest I sleep in the guest room. Instead, she sprang up from the sofa, her face twisted in pure selfish panic. "You lost your job," she screamed, pointing an accusing finger at my chest. "Are you seriously kidding me right now? Who is going to pay the lease on my Tesla this month? You are going to ruin my credit score." I stood there, letting her shrill voice wash over me. For 5 years, I had been the invisible pillar holding this entire family together. When William made disastrous investments and they faced absolute financial ruin, I was the one who quietly stepped in. I paid the massive property taxes. I paid the exorbitant utility bills. I paid the monthly allowance they called rent to cover their grocery bills and country club fees. I funded Naomi's luxury car lease because Andre literally contributed absolutely nothing to the household. I had subsidized their delusion of grandeur for half a decade, playing the role of the humble data analyst while secretly working myself to the bone. And this was my final reward. I did not argue back. I did not cry. I bent down, picked up the empty suitcase, and walked upstairs to gather a few changes of clothes and my personal laptop. When I came back down, the entire family was waiting by the front door like a squad of bouncers. As I reached for the brass doorknob, Andre stepped forward, blocking my exit. The tall black man wore a smug grin that made my stomach turn. He grabbed my left wrist, his fingers digging into my skin, and unclasped the $15,000 Rolex watch I was wearing. I demanded loudly to know what he was doing. Andre chuckled, holding the gold timepiece up to the light. "Consider this payment for the food and utilities you owe your parents for this month," he sneered. "You cannot expect to live here for free and then walk out without settling your debts." William and Caroline watched him steal my property and nodded in approval. I looked silently at the four of them. I did not fight back. Instead, a cold, genuine smile spreads across my face. I told Andre to simply keep it. I walked out into the cold, freezing, and relentless California rain, got into my small, unassuming sedan, and drove away, leaving behind the massive house that was legally entirely mine. Through the rearview mirror, I could see William standing on the grand front porch of the Atherton estate. The relentless rain soaked the shoulders of his cashmere sweater, but his pride kept him rooted to the spot. "Do not come crawling back when you run out of cash," he shouted into the storm, his voice barely cutting through the heavy downpour. I watched his figure shrink as I accelerated down the long, winding driveway. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel a single ounce of regret. Instead, a sudden and immense sense of freedom washed over my entire body. For 5 agonizing years, I had played the role of the dutiful, struggling daughter. I had suffocated my own personality to appease their towering egos and insatiable greed. The heavy chains of familial obligation were finally broken, and ironically, they had been the ones to hand me the bolt cutters. I steered my unassuming sedan onto the Pacific Coast Highway, leaving the suffocating wealth of Silicon Valley behind me. The storm began to break as I drove further south, the dark clouds parting to reveal the brilliant silver moonlight reflecting off the ocean. I drove for hours, letting the rhythmic sound of the tires on the wet pavement clear my mind. My destination was not a cheap motel or a cramped rental apartment. I was heading straight to my actual primary residence, a spectacular $15 million beachfront mansion nestled on a private stretch of coastline in Malibu. I pulled up to the towering security gates of my property. The facial recognition cameras scanned my profile, and the heavy iron gates silently glided open. I drove up the manicured driveway and parked my basic sedan inside a massive climate-controlled garage that already housed my actual daily drivers, a sleek black Aston Martin and a vintage Porsche. I grabbed my wet tote bag and my single piece of luggage, stepping into the grand foyer of my home. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the Pacific Ocean. The house was a masterpiece of modern architecture, featuring heated marble floors, an infinity pool, and a private wine cellar. It was a world away from the toxic environment I had just escaped. I walked into my expansive home office, the nerve center of my true life. I was never just a low-level data analyst struggling to make ends meet. That job was nothing more than a convenient cover story, a way to explain my long hours and modest lifestyle to a family that measured human worth entirely by job titles and designer brands. In reality, I was the sole founder and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings, an anonymous venture capital firm that specialized in incubating and selling high-value tech startups. The reason I had supposedly lost my job earlier that day was that my primary tech venture had just been acquired by a major conglomerate. The buyout was finalized that very afternoon, and the acquisition price was a staggering $80 million. I did not lose my livelihood. I had just secured generational wealth before my 35th birthday. I sat down in my ergonomic leather chair and opened my laptop. The screen illuminated the dark room as I pulled up my private banking portals. For half a decade, I had silently funded the lavish lifestyle of 4 ungrateful people. I had paid the exorbitant property taxes on the Atherton mansion. I had covered the monthly utility bills that ran into the thousands. I paid off Caroline's secondary credit cards whenever her shopping habits exceeded William's dwindling resources. I even set up the automatic lease payments for Naomi's brand new Tesla. They believed they were living off the lingering prestige of William's past success. They had no idea they were entirely dependent on the daughter they had just violently thrown out into the rain. It was time to sever the financial umbilical cord. I clicked on the automatic payment section of my primary checking account. My finger hovered over the trackpad for a fraction of a second before I began systematically dismantling their perfect lives. First, I selected the monthly payment for Naomi's luxury car lease. I clicked cancel. A small green checkmark appeared confirming the action. Next, I moved to the joint credit card account I had quietly guaranteed for Caroline. With another click, I froze the credit limit and suspended all future transactions. Finally, I navigated to the utility and maintenance accounts tied to the Atherton property. I terminated the automatic payments for the electricity, the water, the landscaping service, and the high-speed internet. Within 60 seconds, I had completely choked off the financial lifeblood that kept their luxurious facade intact. I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the dark, rolling waves of the ocean. My family had always been obsessed with appearances. They had built their entire identities on the illusion of superiority and limitless wealth. By cutting off the cash flow, I was not just taking away their money. I was forcing them to face the terrifying reality of their own incompetence. Tomorrow morning, they would wake up expecting to continue their lives of leisure. They would try to buy expensive lattes, drive their luxury cars, and enjoy the comforts of a massive estate. They had no idea that their entire world was about to collapse around them like a fragile house of cards. I closed the laptop, a cold smile touching my lips. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, walked out onto my oceanfront balcony, and breathed in the crisp, salty air. The game had officially changed, and they were unprepared for the reality check waiting for them at sunrise. The morning sun broke over the Pacific, casting a blinding glare across the expansive glass of my master bedroom. I woke up not to the sound of Caroline complaining about the gardener or Naomi screaming about her missing designer shoes, but to the gentle rhythmic crashing of the waves below my balcony. I stretched, relishing the high thread count sheets and the utter silence of my $15 million sanctuary. The air tasted clean, untainted by the heavy, suffocating perfume of pretense that choked the Atherton mansion. I poured myself a cup of freshly brewed Kona coffee and carried it out to the terrace, leaning against the glass railing. Down below, a few early morning surfers were catching the breaks. It was a perfect, tranquil scene, a sharp contrast to the absolute chaos I knew was erupting 400 miles to the north. I imagined the exact moment it happened. Naomi, probably wearing her overpriced yoga pants, strutting out of the local artisanal coffee shop with a $7 matcha latte in hand. She would be walking toward her reserved parking spot at the country club, only to find an empty space and a tow truck driver securing her beloved white Tesla to a flatbed. I could almost hear the shrill, ear-piercing scream. She would undoubtedly pull out her phone, dial my number, and unleash a torrent of entitled fury. My prediction was incredibly accurate. Before I even finished my coffee, my phone, which I had left on the kitchen island, began to vibrate violently. The screen lit up with a rapid succession of notifications. 5 missed calls from Naomi. 7 missed calls from Caroline. 3 from William. My voicemail inbox was full, and a string of frantic text messages flooded my screen. I unlocked the phone, savoring the moment, and tapped on the first message from Naomi. "Stella, you psycho?" She texted, her lack of punctuation betraying her panic. "My car just got repoed in front of literally everyone at the club. They said the payment bounced. Fix this right now, or I swear to God I will make your life a living hell." I chuckled softly and swiped to the next message, this one from my mother. "Stella, what is going on?" Caroline wrote. "My platinum card just declined at Neiman Marcus." The manager looked at me like I was a common criminal. "Did you freeze the account out of some petty revenge? Call me back immediately, this is not funny." I did not reply. I simply watched the messages roll in, each one a testament to their profound ignorance and fragile reality. They genuinely believed that threatening me would somehow solve their problems. They had no concept of accountability, no understanding that actions have consequences. They had thrown me out into the rain, assuming I would crawl back begging for forgiveness, and continuing to subsidize their delusions. Instead, I had severed the cord, and they were in a complete freefall. The most amusing message came from William. "Stella, we need to talk." He wrote, his tone attempting to sound authoritative but failing miserably. "The utility company just called. They said our account is delinquent and they are scheduling a shutoff. We gave you a roof over your head and you repay us by stealing from us. I need you to transfer the funds you owe us immediately before this gets out of hand." The sheer audacity of his message was breathtaking. I owed them nothing. In fact, they owed me their very existence, their status, their comfortable lives. For 5 years, I had been the silent architect of their reality, and now with a few clicks on my laptop, I was dismantling it piece by piece. I set the phone down and walked back into my office. It was time to monitor the real-time impact of my decisions. I opened my laptop and connected to the secure encrypted server that housed the security footage for the Atherton estate. I had installed the high-definition camera system myself, ostensibly for their protection, but practically it gave me complete visibility into the house. I pulled up the feed for the main living room. The scene was pure, unadulterated panic. Caroline was pacing back and forth, her phone pressed to her ear, gesticulating wildly. Naomi was slumped on the sofa, sobbing loudly, her makeup smeared across her face. Andre, looking unusually stressed, was trying to console her while simultaneously scrolling furiously on his tablet. William sat in his leather armchair, a glass of scotch in his hand, looking pale and defeated. The audio feed picked up their frantic voices clearly. "We need cash, and we need it now!" Caroline shrieked, slamming her phone down on the coffee table. "The bank says the accounts are frozen. The credit cards are maxed out. That ungrateful little witch has completely cut us off. How are we going to pay for the country club dues next week?" Naomi wailed louder. "Who cares about the country club, Mom? I do not have a car. How am I supposed to go anywhere? I am pregnant. I need a reliable vehicle." Andre stood up, his face tight with forced confidence. "Listen to me," he said, his smooth scammer voice kicking into gear. "We do not need to panic. We just need to leverage our assets. Stella might have been paying the bills, but we still have the house. This estate is worth at least $8 million. We have the equity. We just need to tap into it." I leaned closer to the screen, my heart pounding with a mixture of disbelief and anticipation. He was actually going to suggest it. I knew Andre was a grifter, always chasing the next big crypto scam or shady real estate flip, but I did not realize he was this bold or this stupid. "I have a plan." Andre continued, pacing the length of the Persian rug. "I am launching a new Web3 startup next month. It is a revolutionary, decentralized real estate platform. It is going to change the entire market. I already have investors lined up, but I need seed capital to secure the initial infrastructure. If we take out a $2 million mortgage on this house, I can guarantee a 10 times return within 6 months. We will pay off the loan, buy Naomi a new car, and you two can retire comfortably. We do not need Stella or her pathetic data analyst salary. We have the house. We have the leverage. We just need to act fast before the utilities get shut off and we lose face in front of the neighbors." I watched as William and Caroline exchanged a glance. The desperation in their eyes was palpable. They were drowning, and Andre had just thrown them a shiny, toxic anvil masquerading as a life preserver. William slowly nodded, his greed and desperation overriding any lingering common sense. "You are right, Andre," William said, his voice trembling slightly. "We have the estate. It is our greatest asset. We will not let Stella humiliate us. We will show her that we do not need her charity. We will leverage the house." I sat back in my chair, a cold, predatory smile forming on my face. They were going to mortgage the house they did not own, the house that legally belonged to Apex Holdings, the house that belonged to me. The trap was set, and they were eagerly walking right into it, completely blind to the fact that they were about to commit federal bank fraud on camera. To understand the sheer magnitude of the crime they were currently plotting on my monitor, you have to understand what actually happened 5 years ago. William and Caroline loved to project an image of generational wealth and untouchable prestige. The reality is that William was an atrocious businessman who squandered his inheritance on terrible investments and flashy status symbols. 5 years ago, the bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on the Atherton mansion. They were weeks away from being physically thrown out onto the street with absolutely nothing to their names. Their wealthy friends had abandoned them and their credit was entirely destroyed. That was when I stepped in, though I made sure they never knew it was me. I had just started seeing the first massive returns from my early tech investments. I created Apex Holdings as a blind trust and corporate entity. Through my lawyers, I purchased the Atherton estate directly from the bank at a private auction, paying the entire balance in cash. I then had my legal team draft a highly convoluted, incredibly dense document that we presented to William and Caroline. We called it a grace period trust agreement. My lawyers told my parents that an anonymous benefactor, someone who supposedly respected William's past business acumen, had purchased the debt and placed the house in a protective trust. They were told they could remain in the house as caretakers to maintain the property value. Because their egos were so massive and their financial literacy so incredibly poor, they swallowed the lie completely. They eagerly signed the paperwork without paying a lawyer to actually read the fine print. They genuinely believed they still retained the deed and the equity. They convinced themselves that this anonymous trust was just a temporary tax loophole and that they were still the masters of the estate. In strict legal terms, they were nothing more than month-to-month tenants living in a property owned exclusively by my company. I was their landlord, and I had been paying my own company the maintenance fees just to keep them from realizing they were entirely bankrupt. Now, watching the security feed from my Malibu office, I witnessed the stunning depth of their hubris. William stood up, puffing out his chest with unearned arrogance. He walked over to an antique mahogany filing cabinet in the corner of the living room and began pulling out thick, dusty folders. "We own this estate free and clear," William proclaimed to Andre, slapping the outdated, legally void paperwork onto the coffee table. "It is the bedrock of our family legacy. A $2 million loan is absolute pocket change against an $8 million property valuation. We can secure this funding and easily cover your startup costs." Caroline clapped her hands together, a greedy smile instantly replacing her earlier panic. She was already calculating how much of that $2 million loan she could siphon off to replace her frozen credit cards and resume her shopping sprees. Naomi wiped away her fake tears, suddenly energized by the prospect of upgrading her repossessed car to an even more expensive luxury vehicle. They were celebrating a massive financial windfall that simply did not exist, built on a foundation of pure delusion. Andre eagerly snatched the folders from the table, his eyes scanning the useless documents. He was a small-time grifter, a man who threw around buzzwords like decentralized finance and blockchain to impress people who knew nothing about technology. He did not possess the legal comprehension to realize the deeds he was holding had been voided half a decade ago. "This is absolutely perfect," Andre said smoothly, running a hand over his stylishly trimmed beard. "I know a guy in the city. He is a private commercial lender who processes equity loans quickly, without the usual bureaucratic red tape. We just need to establish a new corporate entity, transfer the equity into it, and we will have the cash in our accounts by Friday afternoon." He was moving fast, desperate to secure the funds before his own web of financial lies unraveled. But his desperation was blinding him to the legal mechanics of what he was proposing. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, sipping my coffee, as the gravity of their ignorance settled in. If William and Caroline simply walked into a standard retail bank and tried to take out a personal home equity line of credit, the teller would run a basic title search, reject them immediately, and perhaps laugh them out of the building. It would be a humiliating but ultimately harmless reality check. However, Andre was proposing something entirely different. He was talking about transferring corporate equity and utilizing private commercial lenders to bypass standard residential underwriting protocols. To accomplish that, he would have to submit forged documentation to a financial institution. He would have to illegally impersonate the executive officers of Apex Holdings, my venture capital firm, in order to secure a multi-million-dollar commercial mortgage. He was elevating their desperate cash grab from a pathetic family squabble directly into the realm of severe federal crimes. We were no longer talking about hurt feelings and repossessed cars. We were talking about federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and institutional mortgage fraud. I did not feel a shred of panic. Instead, I felt an exhilarating rush of absolute clarity. The game had escalated beyond my wildest expectations. I reached for my phone, but I did not dial the local police precinct. Local authorities would likely treat this as a confusing civil dispute or a minor domestic issue. I needed the heavy artillery. I scrolled through my encrypted contacts and pressed the call button for my lead corporate attorney. He was a ruthless former federal prosecutor who currently handled all aggressive legal shielding for Apex Holdings. The line rang twice before his crisp voice answered. I told him to immediately cancel all of his morning meetings and clear his schedule for the rest of the week. I calmly explained that my family was currently in the living room of the Atherton estate, actively conspiring to forge federal loan documents to illegally mortgage a property owned entirely by our firm. I instructed him to prepare the snare. My family wanted to play high-stakes finance and manipulate the system for their own selfish gain. I was more than happy to oblige them. I was going to give them a front-row seat to a federal sting operation, and I was going to ensure that every single one of them faced the absolute maximum consequences of their actions. My lead corporate attorney, David, did not mince words. Over our encrypted line, he laid out exactly what was about to unfold. If Andre submitted those documents across state lines to a commercial lender, it immediately triggered federal wire fraud statutes. If he falsified the ownership of a corporate entity to secure a loan against a property valued over $10 million, he was looking at aggravated identity theft and institutional mortgage fraud. We did not just have a civil dispute anymore. We had the makings of a federal indictment that carried a mandatory minimum sentence of decades in prison. David dispatched a team of forensic accountants to monitor every digital ping associated with the Atherton property address. We cast a massive digital net over my own house, waiting for Andre to make his fatal move. I spent the next 48 hours working from my Malibu home office, keeping the live security feeds running on my secondary monitors. The atmosphere inside the Atherton mansion was rapidly deteriorating. Without my automatic payments, the reality of their situation was setting in. The landscaping crew abandoned the yard. The pool maintenance company locked the pump room and left a final notice taped to the front gate. Caroline complained constantly about the lack of premium cable channels, completely oblivious to the fact that they were days away from having their water and electricity shut off entirely. Through it all, Andre sat hunched over the dining room table, his laptop screen glowing late into the night. He was frantically trying to secure the $2 million lifeline that would fund his fraudulent startup and keep Naomi draped in designer clothes. Thanks to the administrative access I maintained on the estate router, my security team could mirror Andre's browsing activity. I watched in real time as he logged into a commercial lending portal run by a predatory shadow bank based out of Nevada. He initiated the title search for the Atherton address. I saw his cursor freeze. The digital readout on his screen clearly stated that the deed was not held in a personal grace period trust. The property was exclusively owned by a registered Delaware corporation named Apex Holdings, LLC. I watched Andre through the dining room camera. He rubbed his temples, his face pale with sudden confusion. He called William into the room, pointing at the screen. I turned up the audio feed to listen to their exchange. William squinted at the monitor, his complete lack of business acumen fully exposed. He dismissed the corporate listing with a wave of his hand. He confidently assured Andre that Apex Holdings was merely the shell company the anonymous benefactor used to hold the grace period trust. William genuinely believed he was still the ultimate beneficiary of the property. Andre, driven by desperation and mounting debts from his other failed scams, chose the path of maximum criminality. Instead of backing away, he decided to force the narrative. I listened as Andre confidently explained to my father that the bank just needed the corporate paperwork to match the residential application. He claimed it was a simple administrative hurdle, a minor bureaucratic error that they could easily fix themselves. What happened next was a masterclass in criminal stupidity. I watched the screen mirror as Andre opened a document editing software. He downloaded a generic Articles of Incorporation template from the internet. With terrifying casualness, he began typing. He listed William as the chief executive officer and majority shareholder of Apex Holdings, LLC. He listed himself as the chief financial officer. He digitally forged state seals and fabricated a corporate operating agreement that explicitly granted William the authority to leverage the property for a $2 million commercial mortgage. He printed the fraudulent documents on the heavy stock paper William kept in his home office, forged the necessary signatures with a premium fountain pen, and uploaded the entire fabricated portfolio to the shadow bank lending portal. He hit submit instantly, committing multiple federal felonies. The Nevada lender was predatory, but they were not entirely incompetent. 24 hours later, Andre received an urgent email from the underwriting department. The commercial loan was pre-approved, but there was a massive legal roadblock. The underwriters had pulled the comprehensive residential history of the property to ensure there were no squatters' rights or lingering tenancy claims. They found a specific ironclad residency clause that my lawyers had embedded in the original trust paperwork. The clause stated that the primary occupant of the master suite, legally listed under my name, had to sign a formal quitclaim and residency waiver before any new liens could be placed on the estate. The bank could not legally wire the $2 million until they had a notarized signature from me explicitly relinquishing my right to occupy the property. The panic in the Atherton living room reached a fever pitch. Andre paced furiously, running his hands over his head. He explained the underwriter demand to William, Caroline, and Naomi. They needed my signature. The very daughter they had violently thrown out into the rain just days prior was now the absolute gatekeeper to their $2 million salvation. Naomi screamed that it was impossible, claiming I would never agree to sign anything for them after she had insulted me so viciously. Caroline suggested forging my signature as well, completely ignoring the fact that the bank required an in-person notary for the waiver. William slammed his fist on the coffee table, silencing the room. He insisted he could handle me. He claimed that I was weak, overly emotional, and desperate for their parental approval. He genuinely believed that because I had subsidized their lives for 5 years, I was a pathetic pushover who could easily be manipulated. He told Andre to schedule the final signing with the bank agent in San Francisco. William declared he would call me, offer a tiny olive branch, and manipulate me into signing away my rights. He was going to use my supposed desperation for family love as a weapon. I sat on my Malibu balcony, watching the entire pathetic scheme unfold on my monitors. They thought they were reeling in a naive, desperate daughter. They had absolutely no idea they were summoning the executioner. My private cell phone vibrated against the marble countertop exactly 18 minutes after William made his arrogant declaration in the Atherton living room. I stared at the caller ID, watching his name flash across the screen. I let it ring 4 times, ensuring I appeared appropriately desperate and hesitant before finally swiping to answer. I did not say hello. I simply breathed heavily into the receiver, playing the part of the shattered, abandoned daughter to absolute perfection. "Stella, sweetheart," William said, his voice dripping with a thick, syrupy sweetness that made my skin crawl. "We have been so worried about you. Your mother and I barely slept a wink knowing you were out in that terrible storm. We wanted to give you a few days to cool off, but family is family, and we cannot bear to see you struggling." The sheer audacity of his lie was staggering. I had watched them on the security feed sleeping soundly and complaining about the lack of premium cable, but I kept my tone perfectly fragile. "I have been sleeping in my car, Dad," I lied, injecting a slight tremble into my vocal cords. "The rain was so cold. I do not have enough money for a security deposit on a new apartment. I lost my job, remember? I could practically hear the triumphant smirk forming on his face. He thought he had me completely broken. Listen, Stella. William continued adopting his fake paternal savior persona. We want to help you get back on your feet. Andre is launching a massive new technology business, and it is going to be incredibly lucrative for the whole family. He is securing some initial funding, but because you occupied the master bedroom for so long, the bank needs a standard tax waiver signed to clear the residential history. It is just a minor bureaucratic formality. I remained silent for a few seconds, letting the manufactured tension build. A tax waiver, I asked, feigning ignorance. I do not want to get involved in anything complicated, Dad. I just need a place to sleep. It is completely harmless, he insisted quickly, desperation bleeding through his faux concern. If you come down to a bank branch in San Francisco this Friday and sign the waiver for Andre, I will personally hand you $5,000 in cash. You can use it to get a nice apartment and buy some warm clothes. Think of it as an olive branch, Stella. We want to see you succeed. $5,000. They were attempting to secure a $2 million commercial loan against my $15 million estate, and they were trying to buy my compliance with $5,000. I made a soft sniffling sound into the microphone. You really mean it, Dad? You will give me the cash right there at the bank. You have my word, as your father William promised smoothly. Friday morning at 10 o'clock. We will send you the address. Just wear something presentable and bring your identification. I agreed, meekly thanked him profusely for his supposed generosity, and ended the call. The moment the line went dead, the fragile crying daughter vanished entirely. I tossed the phone onto the kitchen island and let out a sharp, genuine laugh. The bait had been taken, swallowed whole, and now the hook was firmly set in their jaws. I did not waste a single second. I immediately dialed David, my lead corporate attorney. The trap was moving to the final execution phase, and I needed the federal authorities aligned perfectly before Friday morning. I instructed my private helicopter pilot to prep for a short flight up the coast. By early afternoon, I was sitting in the secure glass-walled boardroom of my legal team's high-rise office in the San Francisco financial district. David had assembled a specialized crisis team. Alongside my usual wealth management advisors sat a former federal prosecutor who specialized exclusively in white-collar financial crimes. We projected the forged documents Andre had uploaded to the Nevada shadow bank onto the massive screen at the head of the conference table. The former prosecutor examined the fabricated articles of incorporation, his eyes narrowing as he traced the forged state seals and the fraudulent executive signatures. This is a textbook violation of Title 18, Section 1343 of the United States Code, he stated plainly. Wire fraud. By transmitting these falsified corporate documents across state lines via the internet to secure a loan, your brother-in-law has committed a federal felony. Furthermore, because he is impersonating the corporate officers of Apex Holdings to encumber a property valued at over $10 million, we are looking at severe aggravated identity theft and institutional mortgage fraud. I steepled my fingers, looking at the projected image of William's forged signature. And what is the standard federal response to a crime of this magnitude, I asked. The attorney did not hesitate. The dollar amount elevates the sentencing guidelines drastically. If convicted on all charges, they are facing a mandatory minimum of 20 to 30 years in a federal penitentiary. The Financial Crimes Division takes corporate entity theft incredibly seriously. Make the call, I instructed David. I want the Federal Bureau of Investigation fully briefed and integrated into this signing on Friday. David picked up his secure line and contacted his liaison at the field office. Because Apex Holdings was a legitimate high-revenue corporate entity facing an active multi-million-dollar fraudulent attack, the Bureau moved with terrifying speed. Within 2 hours, a pair of senior federal agents arrived at our boardroom. I handed them the original heavily watermarked and legally sealed incorporation documents of Apex Holdings, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was the sole owner and chief executive officer. I also provided them with the digital logs my security team had captured, showing Andre creating the forged documents from the Atherton Estate IP address. The lead federal agent reviewed the evidence, his expression entirely stoic. "We have a rock-solid case for immediate arrest," the agent confirmed. "The Nevada lender has already been notified of the fraud by our cyber division, and they are cooperating fully." I leaned forward, looking directly into the agent's eyes. "I do not want them arrested at the house," I said coldly. "They thrive on appearances and social status. They think they are walking into a bank to secure their ultimate victory and humiliate me one last time. I want the sting operation to happen exactly when they think they have won. I want them to sign the final fraudulent documents in person." The agent nodded, understanding the psychological warfare at play. "We will intercept the closing," he agreed. "We will utilize an empty conference room at a legitimate downtown bank branch. We will embed 2 undercover agents posing as the local closing representatives for the Nevada lender. When your family arrives to execute the final mortgage paperwork, we will let them commit to the fraud on hidden cameras. The moment they sign their names to the federal loan documents, the trap springs shut." The plan was absolute perfection. My family had spent 5 years treating me like a disposable asset, a pathetic charity case they could manipulate at will. They had thrown me out into a storm to secure their own luxury. Now they were going blindly into a federal sting operation, dressed in their designer clothes, eager to steal my company and leverage my home. They believed Friday morning would be the coronation of their new stolen empire. They had absolutely no idea they were walking directly into a steel cage. Thursday afternoon, less than 24 hours before the scheduled sting operation, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Caroline. Her voice carried a forced, unnatural lightness. She demanded that I come to the Atherton mansion that evening for a welcome-back gathering. She claimed the family wanted to celebrate our reconciliation before the bank meeting on Friday. I knew exactly what this was. It was a containment strategy. They were terrified I might take the $5,000 bribe offer and disappear, or simply forget to show up at the bank. They needed to keep me on a tight leash, locked in their line of sight until my signature was on those fraudulent documents. I played my part flawlessly. I told her I would be there, making sure to sound appropriately grateful for their charity. I drove my modest sedan back up to Silicon Valley. Instead of wearing my custom-tailored suits or my designer accessories, I dressed in a faded, oversized sweater and scuffed sneakers. I needed to look exactly like the broken, defeated woman they expected to see. When I pulled through the wrought iron gates of the Atherton estate, I was greeted by a spectacle of pure financial delusion. Dozens of luxury cars lined the circular driveway. Valets in crisp uniforms were rushing back and forth. Andre and Naomi were not just having a quiet family dinner. They had organized a massive catered investor party to celebrate their impending $2 million windfall. They had hired private chefs, bartenders, and a string quartet. All of this was undoubtedly being paid for on high-interest credit cards, banking entirely on the fraudulent commercial loan closing the next morning. I walked through the grand front doors, keeping my head down. Before I could even take off my coat, Caroline intercepted me. She grabbed my arm tightly, her acrylic nails digging into my skin, and dragged me directly into the caterer's kitchen. Her fake smile vanished the second we were out of sight from the guests. "You look like absolute trash, Stella," she hissed, looking me up and down with pure disgust. "If you are going to be here, you are going to earn your keep. Do not speak to any of Andre's investors. Do not talk about your pathetic situation. You are going to take this tray and serve champagne. Try to blend into the background like the hired help." I looked at the heavy silver tray loaded with crystal champagne flutes. I was the sole owner and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. I legally owned the very ground Caroline was standing on. Yet here she was treating me like an indentured servant in my own multi-million-dollar property. I did not argue. I simply nodded, took the tray, and walked out into the main living room. Playing the role of a silent waitress gave me the perfect cover to observe their crimes up close. I circulated through the crowd, offering drinks to local venture capitalists and tech executives. Andre was holding court by the fireplace wearing a tailored velvet blazer. I stood near a marble pillar, perfectly positioned to listen. Andre was spinning a web of absolute lies. He was pitching his decentralized real estate platform, claiming he had already secured $2 million in institutional backing. He pointed to the Atherton mansion, loudly declaring to the investors that his family owned the property free and clear, using it as proof of his financial stability. He was actively committing securities fraud right in front of me, lying to potential investors to secure even more funding for a company that did not actually exist. As I passed the dining room, Naomi intentionally bumped into my shoulder. I managed to keep the champagne tray steady, but she spilled a drop of her drink on the floor. She sighed dramatically, looking at me with pure contempt. "Watch where you are going, Stella," she snapped. She reached up to adjust a massive, sparkling diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. "You like it?" she asked smugly. "Andre bought it for me this morning to celebrate his big deal. It is a push present for the baby. It must be so miserable for you being 34, unemployed, and totally alone. Just try not to ruin my night with your depressing energy." She had bought a diamond necklace on credit, leveraging a loan that was going to put her husband in federal prison. I offered a polite, subservient nod and walked away, recording every interaction in my memory for the prosecutors. An hour later, Andre clinked a silver spoon against his champagne flute, calling for the room to pay attention. The string quartet stopped playing. The wealthy guests turned toward the fireplace. Andre raised his glass, puffing out his chest. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight to witness the birth of a new empire," he announced smoothly. "Building a legacy takes hustle, vision, and a refusal to accept failure." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd until they locked onto me, standing in the corner in my faded sweater. "Not everyone has that drive." He continued, his tone dripping with condescension. "Some people give up at the first sign of hardship. Some people expect handouts. But the people in this room, we are builders. We take what is ours." William and Caroline stood right beside him, beaming with pride. They nodded in enthusiastic agreement, completely discarding me in front of 50 influential guests. They were validating a scam artist while publicly humiliating their own daughter. Andre looked directly at me, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "To building empires," he toasted. The crowd raised their glasses. I did not look away. I did not shrink back into the shadows. I stood tall, balanced the silver tray on one hand, and picked up a single glass of champagne with the other. I locked eyes with Andre, offering him a smile that was entirely devoid of warmth. I raised my glass directly toward him. "To your new empire, Andre," I said, projecting my voice just enough to cut through the quiet murmur of the room. "I cannot wait to see your entire vision come to life at the bank tomorrow at 10 in the morning." Andre's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, unsettled by the raw confidence in my tone, but his massive ego quickly overrode his instincts. He assumed I was simply a defeated woman, accepting her place at the bottom of the food chain. He turned back to his guests, laughing loudly and drinking his champagne. Caroline glared at me, mouthing the words, "Get back to work." I calmly set my glass down, placed the tray on a side table, and walked out the front door. The trap was fully primed. The federal agents were waiting in the shadows, and my family was about to face the most devastating morning of their entire lives. As I drove away from the Atherton mansion, the heavy bass of Andre's ridiculous party faded into the quiet hum of my sedan's engine. The crisp night air blowing through my window felt incredibly refreshing after hours of breathing in their suffocating delusions. They were celebrating a victory they had not won, spending money they did not possess, and mocking the very person who held their entire future in her hands. I did not head back to Malibu. Instead, I drove directly into the heart of downtown San Francisco. While my family was busy getting drunk on cheap champagne and fake prestige, I had a midnight briefing to attend. I pulled into the secure underground parking garage of the high-rise building that housed my legal team. The elevator shot up to the top floor, opening directly into a massive glass-walled conference room overlooking the glittering city skyline. This was the war room. Waiting for me around the polished mahogany table were David, my lead corporate attorney, a team of specialized forensic accountants, and 2 senior agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, White-Collar Crime Division. The contrast between my family's pathetic charade and the immense legitimate power gathered in this room was staggering. David stood up as I entered, gesturing to the illuminated screen at the head of the table. He had spent the last several hours dissecting every single digital footprint Andre had left behind. "We need to finalize the operational parameters for tomorrow morning," David said, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "We have completely verified the extent of the criminality. Andre has formally submitted the fabricated articles of incorporation to the commercial lender. He digitally forged William's signature as the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings and listed himself as the chief financial officer." The specialized crisis attorney sitting next to David leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. He looked at me with a serious, clinical expression. "We want to be absolutely clear about the legal strategy we are deploying," he explained. "Because Apex Holdings is a legally registered corporate entity with a multi-million-dollar valuation attempting to forge its officers to secure a massive commercial loan immediately triggers heavy federal jurisdiction. This is not a local real estate dispute. Andre's actions constitute explicit federal mortgage fraud and federal wire fraud. By transmitting these fraudulent documents across state lines to a lender in Nevada, he has committed crimes that carry mandatory minimum sentences of decades in a federal penitentiary." I walked over to the table and looked at the printed copies of the forged documents. Andre had been so arrogant, so blinded by his own greed, that he had not even bothered to obscure his IP address when uploading the files. He had handed us a pristine, airtight case. My lawyers had meticulously compiled every piece of evidence, formatting the data logs and the forged submissions into a comprehensive dossier. Earlier that day, my legal team had officially handed this dossier over to the federal authorities. The lead FBI agent, a tall, imposing man named Agent Miller, tapped a thick manila folder resting on the table. "Your legal team handed us a golden ticket," Agent Miller stated plainly. "White-collar fraud cases usually take months of arduous investigation to build a solid foundation. You have handed us the entire crime wrapped in a bow, complete with timestamps and digital fingerprints. The moment your lawyers contacted our division and provided the forged submissions, we immediately authorized a full sting operation." Agent Miller stood up and walked over to a whiteboard, sketching out the physical layout of the bank branch where the closing was scheduled to take place. He detailed the exact setup for the following morning. "We have coordinated fully with the actual bank executives," he explained. "The private conference room your family booked for 10 o'clock has been completely wired for high-definition audio and video recording. The loan officer they believe they have been communicating with has been replaced. When they walk into that room, they will be greeted by two of my finest undercover agents posing as the commercial lending director and the closing notary." I listened intently as the agent laid out the trap. The operation was designed to catch Andre, William, and Naomi absolutely red-handed. The federal agents were not going to arrest them in the lobby. They needed the crime to reach its absolute pinnacle. The undercover agents would present the physical loan documents to my family. They would ask William to verbally confirm his identity as the CEO of Apex Holdings. They would ask Andre to confirm his position as CFO. Then they would hand them the pens. "We need them to sign the physical paperwork," David emphasized, looking directly at me. "The moment William and Andre put their signatures on those federal bank documents in front of a supposed notary, the fraud becomes undeniable and permanent. It moves from a digital attempt to an executed physical crime." "And what about my sister?" I asked, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Naomi was fully complicit, wearing stolen property and eagerly participating in the scheme. Agent Miller gave a curt nod. "She will be in the room actively participating in the execution of the fraudulent loan. She is an accessory to federal mortgage fraud. Furthermore, your lawyers briefed us on the stolen $15,000 Rolex currently on her wrist. If she walks into that bank wearing stolen property across state lines, she will be detained for grand theft alongside her husband. No one in that room is walking out free." The setup was flawless. My family believed they had outsmarted the system. They thought they had bullied their unemployed daughter into signing away her residency rights for a measly $5,000 bribe. They were going to wake up tomorrow, put on their best designer suits, and walk into a bank expecting to walk out as millionaires. They had absolutely no idea that the bank employees were federal agents, the cameras were rolling, and the daughter they had abused for a lifetime was the orchestrator of their absolute ruin. I thanked the agents and my legal team for their exceptional work. As I left the conference room and headed to a luxury hotel suite my team had booked for the night, a profound sense of peace settled over me. The board was set. The pieces were locked into their inevitable positions. All that was left to do was show up, play my part, and watch the entire toxic empire burn to ashes. I lay in the king-sized bed of my hotel suite staring up at the ceiling. For the first time in 34 years, I felt no anxiety about dealing with William, Caroline, or Naomi. I did not feel the usual tightening in my chest or the overwhelming burden of trying to earn their impossible approval. I closed my eyes and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Tomorrow morning, the Atherton mansion would finally be cleansed of its parasites, and justice would be served precisely at 10 o'clock. The arrogance of a scammer is truly something to behold. Andre, completely high on the delusion of impending wealth, did not just want to secure the fraudulent loan. He wanted to parade his fake success in front of the entire Silicon Valley elite. Thursday afternoon, barely 20 hours before the scheduled bank meeting, I watched through my security feeds as catering trucks rolled up the driveway of the Atherton mansion. Andre and Naomi were throwing a massive, ridiculously expensive investor party to celebrate the launch of his non-existent Web3 startup. They had hired private chefs, professional mixologists, and a string quartet. I pulled up their credit card activity, which I still monitored despite having frozen the accounts. They were racking up tens of thousands of dollars in debt on high-interest alternative credit lines, betting their entire miserable existence on the $2 million they believed I was going to hand them the next morning. My phone rang. It was Caroline. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not apologize for throwing me out into a storm. Instead, she demanded my presence at the mansion that evening. "We are hosting a very important gathering for Andre's new venture," she announced, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We want to welcome you back into the fold, Stella. It is important that the family presents a united front." I knew exactly what this was. It was a containment strategy. They were terrified I might take the $5,000 bribe offer and disappear, or simply forget to show up at the bank. They needed to keep me on a tight leash, locked in their line of sight, until my signature was on those fraudulent documents. I played my part flawlessly. I told her I would be there, making sure to sound appropriately grateful for their charity. I left my Malibu estate and drove my modest sedan back up to Silicon Valley. I bypassed my custom-tailored suits and designer accessories. Instead, I dressed in a faded, oversized gray sweater, a pair of worn-out jeans, and scuffed sneakers. I pulled my hair back into a messy bun and wore absolutely no makeup. I needed to look exactly like the broken, defeated, unemployed woman they expected to see. When I pulled through the wrought iron gates of the Atherton estate, I was greeted by a spectacle of pure financial delusion. Dozens of luxury cars, Porsches, McLarens, and customized Range Rovers lined the circular driveway. Valets in crisp uniforms were rushing back and forth, opening doors for local venture capitalists and tech executives whom Andre had somehow managed to invite. I parked my cheap sedan at the very end of the driveway, far away from the glittering display of wealth. I walked through the grand front doors, keeping my head down and my shoulders slumped. The stark contrast between my appearance and the designer-clad guests was immediate and glaring. Women dripping in diamonds and men in bespoke Italian suits turned to look at me, their expressions a mix of confusion and disdain. I was the visual representation of failure in a room dedicated to worshipping success. I had barely stepped into the foyer before Caroline intercepted me. She grabbed my arm tightly, her acrylic nails digging into my skin through the fabric of my sweater. Her fake smile vanished the second we were out of sight from the guests. "You look like absolute trash, Stella," she hissed, looking me up and down with pure disgust. "I cannot believe you showed up to a high-profile investor gathering looking like a homeless person." I told her I did not have time to change, keeping my voice soft and subservient. Caroline scoffed, rolling her eyes. "If you are going to be here, you are going to earn your keep. Do not speak to any of Andre's investors. Do not talk about your pathetic situation. I am not having you embarrass this family." She dragged me directly into the caterer's kitchen, shoving past a group of startled waitstaff. She picked up a heavy silver tray loaded with crystal champagne flutes and shoved it into my hands. "You are going to take this tray and serve drinks," she ordered. "Try to blend into the background like the hired help. And remember, we expect you at the bank tomorrow morning. Do not make me regret letting you back into this house." I looked down at the heavy silver tray. I was the sole owner and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. I legally owned the very ground Caroline was standing on. The champagne glasses she was forcing me to serve were purchased with money I had provided. Yet here she was treating me like an indentured servant in my own multi-million-dollar property. I did not argue. I did not throw the tray in her face. I simply nodded, obediently took the tray, and walked out into the main living room. Playing the role of a silent waitress gave me the perfect cover to observe their crimes up close. I circulated through the crowd, offering drinks to local venture capitalists and tech executives. Andre was holding court by the massive stone fireplace, wearing a tailored velvet blazer and gesturing expansively with a Scotch glass. I stood near a marble pillar, perfectly positioned to listen. Andre was spinning a web of absolute lies. He was pitching his decentralized real estate platform, claiming he had already secured $2 million in institutional backing. He pointed to the vaulted ceiling of the Atherton mansion, loudly declaring to the investors that his family owned the property free and clear, using my house as proof of his financial stability. He was actively committing securities fraud right in front of me, lying to potential investors to secure even more funding for a company that did not actually exist. As I passed the dining room, Naomi intentionally bumped into my shoulder. I managed to keep the champagne tray steady, but she spilled a drop of her drink on the floor. She sighed dramatically, looking at me with pure contempt. "Watch where you are going, Stella," she snapped. She reached up to adjust a massive sparkling diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. "You like it?" she asked smugly. "Andre bought it for me this morning to celebrate his big deal. It is a push present for the baby. It must be so miserable for you being 34, unemployed, and totally alone. Just try not to ruin my night with your depressing energy." She had bought a diamond necklace on credit, leveraging a loan that was going to put her husband in federal prison. I offered a polite, subservient nod and walked away. I continued to serve champagne, moving invisibly through the crowd, recording every interaction in my memory for the federal prosecutors who were waiting in the shadows. I moved away from Naomi and her stolen diamonds, slipping back into the current of the party. Acting as a waitress in the very house I legally owned provided a unique psychological vantage point. People do not notice the help. They treat you as a piece of furniture, a silent fixture that dispenses alcohol and collects empty glasses. I used this invisibility to my absolute advantage. I glided toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows where Andre had cornered a group of prominent Silicon Valley venture capitalists. I recognized two of them from my own legitimate business dealings. Thankfully, I had always kept my identity as the founder of Apex Holdings, strictly anonymous, utilizing legal proxies and non-disclosure agreements, so these men only knew me as a rumored ghost in the financial sector, not the woman currently offering them hors d'oeuvres. I kept my head bowed and offered the silver tray, positioning myself just behind Andre's right shoulder. He was completely in his element, radiating the toxic confidence of a career con artist. He handed a glossy, professionally printed prospectus to a silver-haired investor. The printout featured the Atherton mansion on the cover. "We are revolutionizing the blockchain real estate market," Andre boasted, his voice carrying over the string quartet. "We are not just looking for outside capital, we have skin in the game. My father-in-law William is the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. He is personally backing this venture. In fact, we are closing a massive commercial equity loan against this very estate tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. $2 million of our own family money is going directly into the seed round." I carefully collected an empty champagne flute from the table, memorizing every single word. Andre was not just lying to his family anymore. He was actively soliciting millions of dollars from accredited investors by misrepresenting his assets, fabricating his corporate backing, and presenting forged financial leverage. He was layering Securities and Exchange Commission violations right on top of his pending federal wire fraud charges. The investors nodded, clearly impressed by the sheer physical proof of the mansion surrounding them. It was the perfect grift. They saw the marble floors, the luxury cars in the driveway, and the confident family hosting them. They had no idea the entire operation was built on stolen air. Before I could listen to the rest of his fraudulent pitch, fingers snapped sharply right next to my ear. I turned to see Caroline glaring at me. She grabbed me by the elbow and yanked me forcefully away from the venture capitalist, dragging me back toward the catering kitchen. "What do you think you are doing?" she hissed, her voice vibrating with suppressed rage. "I told you to serve, not to stand around eavesdropping on conversations you cannot possibly understand. You are a charity case, Stella. You are here because we took pity on you. Earn your keep, or I will have security throw you out into the street right now." I kept my expression entirely blank, playing the submissive role she demanded. "I apologize," I said quietly. "I was just clearing the empty glasses." Caroline sneered, grabbing a fresh bottle of champagne from the counter and shoving it against my chest. "Stop making pathetic excuses. Andre is securing our family legacy tonight. He is doing what you completely failed to do. You had all the potential in the world and you threw it away to become a redundant data analyst who could not even hold down a job. Look at you. 34 years old, no husband, no career, and sleeping in your car. It is embarrassing. Now get back out there and make yourself useful before I lose my temper completely." I nodded, took the bottle, and returned to the main hall. The utter irony of her lecture was almost intoxicating. She was lecturing the owner of a multi-million-dollar venture capital firm about financial responsibility, while actively participating in a scheme that would land her entire family in federal prison. I walked past the grand staircase where Naomi was now holding court with a group of her equally vapid, status-obsessed friends. When Naomi saw me approaching, her eyes lit up with malicious joy. She waved me over deliberately, intending to use me as a prop for her own vanity. "Ladies, champagne is here," Naomi announced loudly, ensuring everyone in her circle turned to look at me. She snatched a glass from my tray and gestured toward me with her free hand. "I do not think you have all met my older sister, Stella. She is currently between jobs and well between homes too, but family takes care of their own right. We are letting her help out tonight so she can feel productive." Her friends offered me looks of exaggerated, mocking pity. One of them actually sighed and said how sweet it was of Naomi to give me a chance to work. Naomi basked in their approval. She reached up and stroked the diamond necklace resting on her chest again, making sure the jewels caught the light from the chandelier. "Andre is just so generous," Naomi bragged, her voice amplified for my benefit. "He told me that once the bank clears our $2 million funding tomorrow, we are completely gutting the master bedroom. We are knocking down the walls of Stella's old room to build a custom nursery and a walk-in closet for my new wardrobe. It is going to be absolutely breathtaking. It is just so nice to have a real man in the family who knows how to provide. No offense, Stella. We all know you struggle with keeping a man around." I stood perfectly still, letting her insults wash over me. She was standing in my house, drinking my champagne, mocking my romantic life, and bragging about destroying my bedroom with money she was attempting to steal from me. It required every ounce of my willpower not to burst into laughter right there in the foyer. The level of cosmic retribution awaiting them was going to be spectacular. "None taken, Naomi," I replied, my voice smooth and utterly calm. "I think it is wonderful that you and Andre are planning so aggressively for the future. You definitely deserve everything that is coming to you." Naomi smirked, completely missing the lethal double meaning of my words. "Exactly," she said, turning her back to me to rejoin her friends. "Now be a dear and fetch us some of those caviar appetizers." I walked away, my silver tray held high. They had completely taken the bait. They were drunk on their own arrogance, totally blind to the cliff edge they were rapidly approaching. The night was proceeding flawlessly, and the countdown to tomorrow morning's federal sting operation was officially underway. The party reached a fever pitch of sycophantic laughter and clinking crystal as Andre stepped onto the small wooden stage that had been erected for the evening. He stood there, his velvet blazer catching the light of the designer chandeliers, looking every bit the protagonist of a movie he had invented for himself. My parents were positioned front and center, their eyes glassy with a mix of alcohol and pure, unadulterated vanity. They were watching him with a level of adoration they had never once directed toward me in my entire 34 years. It was as if Andre had successfully gaslit even them into believing he was the savior of the Blackwell lineage. Andre cleared his throat, the sound amplified by the premium sound system he had insisted on renting. He began by thanking the guests for their generosity and for seeing the incredible promise in his decentralized real estate platform. His speech was a masterpiece of corporate buzzwords and fabricated success stories. He painted a picture of himself as a self-made visionary who was reshaping the very nature of global property management. He spoke of the Atherton mansion not as a roof over his head, but as a testament to his own financial prowess. Then came the calculated strike. Andre pivoted his gaze, sweeping over the crowd until it settled squarely on me. He gestured casually in my direction, with his scotch glass, an expression of performative sympathy plastered on his face. He talked about the necessity of shedding dead weight in any professional endeavor. He described a hypothetical project manager who had failed to evolve, who had lacked the fire of true innovation, and who had ultimately been forced to face the harsh realities of a competitive market. It was a thinly veiled, utterly cruel allegory for my life designed to confirm to the room that I was the black sheep, the failure, the sister-in-law, who simply did not have the guts to compete at their level. My parents nodded in rhythmic synchronicity with his points, their heads bobbing like puppets on strings. My father actually clapped, a sharp ringing sound that echoed through the silent room. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and disdain, confirming to the surrounding venture capitalists that their daughter was indeed a cautionary tale of professional stagnation. Naomi, standing to my right, leaned in close to her circle of friends, whispering something that triggered a wave of giggles. They were completely insulated in their own bubble of hubris, believing that their public mockery would be the final crushing blow that silenced me forever. I did not flinch. I did not look at the floor. I did not retreat into the shadows of the pillars. I stood my ground, my silver champagne tray held at my side, my posture perfectly relaxed. I waited for the exact moment the room went silent, after his final grandiloquent flourish about building legacies. As Andre stood there basking in the applause of people he had lied to, I slowly raised my flute of champagne. I did not shout, I did not cause a scene, and I did not let a shred of visible anger seep into my demeanor. I projected my voice clearly and calmly across the room, ensuring that every single investor in that living room could hear me perfectly. I can't wait to see your vision come to life at the bank tomorrow at 10 in the morning. I said, my tone light breezy and entirely devoid of any threat. The room dipped into a momentary state of confusion. Andre's smirk didn't disappear, but it did stiffen. He clearly expected me to have scurried out of the room by now. He interpreted my comment as the submissive, desperate rambling of a woman who was still trying to be relevant. He chuckled, a deep, patronizing sound that was meant to elicit laughter from his audience. "See you there, Stella," he replied, his eyes filled with a predatory gleam. "I am sure you will find the final paperwork enlightening." He thought he had completely broken my spirit, that I was merely a pathetic spectator at the funeral of my own life. He truly believed I was arriving tomorrow morning to sign my rights away, to humbly accept my exile, and to hand over the keys to his fraudulent future. He turned away from me dismissively to continue courting a prominent real estate investor who had been watching the entire exchange with a furrowed brow. I set my glass down on a nearby side table. I felt the gaze of several people who had witnessed the exchange. They weren't laughing at me. They were watching with a newfound subtle curiosity. Professor Howard, who had been chatting with a donor near the wall, caught my eye. He didn't smirk, and he didn't pity me. He had seen the exact moment my statement shifted the atmosphere in the room. He seemed to recognize that something about the balance of power had fundamentally changed, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly why. I moved through the crowd for the last time. My mother tried to stop me again, her face twisted in annoyance, demanding to know why I hadn't gone to the kitchen to assist with the buffet. I brushed past her, not saying a word, and exited through the heavy oak doors. The evening was over. The performance was concluded. Every witness had been primed, every lie had been catalogued, and the final stage of the trap was set. They were walking into that bank tomorrow morning with their hearts full of greed and their minds full of false hope. They were entirely unprepared for the reality that would be waiting for them inside that conference room. I stepped into my car and drove away from the house one last time, knowing that when I returned the next day, it would be as the rightful owner with the full force of federal law behind me. The house was already dead to me. The people inside were already finished. Everything was precisely where it needed to be. The morning air in downtown San Francisco was crisp and carried the sharp metallic scent of the financial district. I stood across the street from the bank branch, observing through my car window as the black luxury SUV pulled up to the curb. It was a perfectly choreographed display of unearned superiority. William stepped out first, adjusting his silk tie, his face fixed in a mask of stern impatience. Caroline followed her fingers, clutching a leather handbag that cost more than my first apartment, her head held at an angle that signaled she expected the world to bow. Naomi and Andre emerged last, their hands linked, walking with the swagger of people who believed they were about to secure their future at the expense of their own family. They didn't just walk into the bank, they invaded it. They strode toward the elevator like royalty returning to reclaim a kingdom. I watched via a real-time video link on my phone as they entered the sleek, glass-walled conference room on the executive floor. The room was furnished with minimalist high-end decor, and the lighting was clinical and bright. Two men in sharp conservative suits sat at the head of the table. To my family, these were the loan officer and the closing notary for the Nevada-based private lender. In reality, they were seasoned FBI agents who had spent their entire careers cataloging the exact type of arrogance currently radiating from my family. The bank staff, the real ones, had been briefed and quietly ushered out of the executive area. The undercover agents played their roles with chilling precision. They maintained a demeanor of cold, professional detachment, which only served to make William more aggressive. He didn't want professional, he wanted subservience. He slammed his briefcase onto the polished table, the sound echoing in the silent room. "We have an appointment at 10 o'clock sharp," William barked, checking his watch with a pointed, exaggerated movement. "Time is money, and we have an investor party to recover from. Where's the director of lending?" The agent posing as the loan officer didn't blink. He simply motioned toward the folder of documents that lay in the center of the table. He informed them that the director was currently reviewing the final internal compliance checks and would join them momentarily. Andre, ever the center of his own universe, began to grow restless. He started pacing the length of the glass-walled room, his eyes scanning the San Francisco skyline with greedy anticipation. He couldn't help himself. The need to brag was an addiction he couldn't control. He leaned down over the table, speaking to the agent acting as the loan officer in a conspiratorial, inflated tone. "You guys realize the scale of this project, right?" Andre said, gesturing broadly to the empty space as if he were talking to a freshman intern rather than a federal agent. "This Web3 real estate platform is going to completely flip the commercial market. We are talking about a 10 times return on this initial seed capital within the first 2 quarters. My family has been in real estate for decades. We know exactly what we are doing. The Atherton estate is just the tip of the iceberg. Once this house is leveraged, we are looking at rolling this model out across 3 other properties in our private portfolio." The undercover agent nodded slowly, his face an impenetrable mask of interest. "That sounds like a significant undertaking, Mr. Andre, and your father-in-law is the primary equity holder for Apex Holdings." Andre didn't even hesitate. He clapped William on the shoulder with enough force to make the older man wince. "That is correct. William is the visionary behind the firm. I am the architect of the growth strategy. We have been planning this specific structure for months. It is ironclad. He leaned in his voice, dropping to a whisper of manufactured conspiracy. Look, I know you guys have your compliance hoops to jump through, but let's make sure we move the wire transfer immediately after the signatures. We have suppliers waiting on deposits, and we have a reputation to maintain. I sat in my car listening to every syllable. The audacity was truly mind-numbing. Andre was actively selling his fraud to a federal agent, using every cliché in the scammer's handbook to appear sophisticated and wealthy. William, meanwhile, sat back in his chair with his arms crossed, periodically glancing at his watch and tapping his heel against the carpet. Caroline and Naomi were huddled together at the far end of the table, whispering about the high-end shopping they intended to do once the funds hit their personal accounts. Naomi was scrolling through her phone looking at a digital catalog for a high-end jewelry store, likely imagining her next diamond upgrade. They had been waiting for only 6 minutes, but for them it was an eternity. Their sense of entitlement was so extreme that any minor delay felt like a personal insult to their status. William groaned, a sound of profound irritation. "This is completely unacceptable," he announced to the room, though there was no one to impress other than the bank staff and his own family. "If they don't have the paperwork ready, I might have to reconsider which lender we use for our future expansion." He was actually threatening the FBI with the loss of his business. I felt a surge of cold, hard satisfaction. They were so thoroughly committed to their lie, so utterly convinced of their own untouchable status, that they couldn't conceive of a world where their demands weren't met with instant groveling compliance. They were trapped in their own hubris, and the walls were about to close in. The door handle clicked, and the director of lending, the final undercover agent, stepped into the room. He held a thick, heavy document folder in his hands. The game was about to reach its final fatal turn. The director of lending placed the heavy folder in the center of the table with a soft, authoritative thud. William leaned forward, his face flushed, with the kind of impatient greed that only comes to those who believe a fortune is already theirs. Andre began tapping his fingers on the surface, his eyes flicking constantly between the folder and the door, clearly eager to sign the fraud, receive the confirmation, and leave this sterile environment behind. The air in the room was thick with the scent of high stakes and impending catastrophe. Just as William reached for the pen, the double glass doors at the rear of the conference room swung open with a sharp, controlled click. The sudden noise made Andre jump, his hand hovering mid-air. I stepped into the room, but I was not the broken, faded version of myself they had seen the night before. I was draped in a pristine, custom-tailored midnight blue Tom Ford suit, the sharp lines of the blazer accentuating a posture of absolute authority. My hair was pulled back into a sleek professional bun, and my eyes were shielded behind dark, sophisticated frames. I was flanked by 2 senior partners from my legal firm, men who looked like they were bred specifically to crush dreams and dismantle empires in a courtroom. The contrast was impossible to ignore. I looked like the person who owned the building. My family looked like people about to be evicted from it. Caroline, whose back was to the door, didn't even turn around before she started in on her performance. "Where have you been, Stella? You are late, and the director is already here with the final documents. Sit down in that witness chair in the corner and sign the paper. We do not have all day to wait for you to find your focus." I didn't stop walking. I didn't acknowledge the chair in the corner. I strode directly toward the head of the mahogany table, the seat exclusively reserved for the entity owner, the person with the final, absolute say over every asset in the room. My family's eyes followed me. I watched the progression of their reactions. William, who had been leaning forward in anticipation of the loan, suddenly sat bolt upright, his face pale and slack. Naomi, who had been texting on her phone, froze, her thumb hovering over the screen. Andre stood up slightly, his brow furrowing as he attempted to process the sight of me in such a commanding, polished state. He was trying to reconcile the woman he had just mocked for being an unemployed mess with the woman currently walking with the grace of a titan. I reached the head of the table and didn't wait for an invitation. I pulled out the chair and sat down with deliberate, slow movements. I placed my leather briefcase on the surface and unlatched the gold hardware. The sound of the lock snapping open was loud in the dead silence of the room. I reached inside and withdrew a thick, leather-bound portfolio. With a flick of my wrist, I dropped the original heavily watermarked incorporation documents of Apex Holdings right onto the center of the table, exactly on top of their fraudulent loan application. The papers slid across the smooth mahogany, coming to a stop directly in front of William. He stared at them, his eyes darting frantically across the text. His hands began to shake, and he didn't reach for them. He knew those documents. He had seen them in my office years ago when I first started the holding company to save them. He knew the weight of that seal. He knew the reality of the ownership. I leaned back, resting my elbows on the armrests, and looked at them with a detached, chilling level of calm. "I noticed you all were having a bit of a disagreement about the financial structure of the Atherton estate," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "You seem to be under the impression that this property is part of a family legacy that you are free to leverage as you please. You seem to believe that my employment status or my personal life has any bearing on your ability to commit financial crimes." Andre's face was rapidly losing all color. He looked at the documents, then at the loan officer, and finally at me. "This is a joke," he stammered, his dapper veneer completely stripped away. "You're playing some kind of sick game, Stella. You're an analyst. You don't own Apex Holdings." I didn't answer him. I simply picked up a pen, twirled it between my fingers, and looked at the undercover agent sitting to my right. "Is there any reason we should delay the verification of the ownership documents before we proceed with the signing?" I asked. The agent, his face entirely unreadable, tapped the folder. "There is no reason for a delay," he said, his voice cold. "We have already verified the ownership records. The documents provided by Apex Holdings are legitimate, and the property deed is clearly held in the name of the corporation. The loan application currently on the table, however, appears to contain significant inaccuracies regarding the corporate structure and officer identity." The room erupted. William stood up, his face turning an angry shade of purple. "This is a setup," he roared. "My daughter is trying to ruin us." He grabbed the documents and began frantically shuffling through them, searching for any legal loophole or mistake. But there were no mistakes. Everything I had presented was the unvarnished legal truth. They had walked into a trap they had designed themselves, using a company I owned to secure a loan on a house I paid for. The power shift was absolute. They were no longer the authority figures, they were the suspects, and I was the one who held the pen. The silence that followed my declaration was not just an absence of sound. It was the heavy, suffocating pressure of a life built on sand finally collapsing into the sea. William gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white, his face cycling through shades of shock denial, and finally a terrifying vein-popping rage. He looked as if he might suffer a stroke right there in the conference room. Caroline, meanwhile, had reached for a glass of water, but her hand shook so violently that the ice clinked frantically against the crystal, a frantic rhythm that underscored the total disintegration of her social standing. Naomi had stopped sobbing. She sat frozen, her eyes wide, staring at me with a mixture of hatred and profound childlike confusion, as if she were seeing a stranger inhabiting her sister's body. I didn't give them a moment to formulate a coordinated defense. I motioned for my lawyer to take the lead. David stepped forward, his movements practiced and efficient. He slid a crisp, plastic-wrapped document folder directly toward William. "These are the certified property tax records for the Atherton estate," David announced, his voice cool and devoid of emotion. "You will note that since the foreclosure auction 5 years ago, the sole property taxpayer has been Apex Holdings, LLC. For half a decade, your family has been living in a residence where you have zero equity, zero legal ownership, and zero right to leverage against any financial institution. You have been residing there as guests, or perhaps more accurately as tenants at will under my client's grace period." Naomi let out a sharp, hysterical laugh that sounded like it had been ripped from her throat. She looked at me, her eyes burning with malice. "You think this is funny? You think it's cute to pretend you're some kind of secret mogul?" We all know you're a bitter failed data analyst who got lucky on a tech gamble. This is a game, Stella. You're playing a game, and when the bank realizes these documents are just your delusions, you'll be the one out on the street. I stayed perfectly still. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to insult them back. I simply looked at the agent sitting across from them, the one pretending to be a bank official, and nodded. The agent, maintaining his perfect cover of professional indifference, opened the manila envelope and laid out the bank statements I had provided earlier that morning. They documented every single payment made to the utility companies, the landscapers, the high-speed internet providers, and the insurance firms that protected the mansion. I have been paying for your lifestyle for 60 months, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Yet the quiet in the room made it resonate like a thunderclap. Every vacation you took, every dinner you hosted, every piece of jewelry Naomi wore, it was all subsidized by me. I wasn't just your daughter or your sister. I was your financier. And you threw me out because you were bored of me, because I didn't fit the picture-perfect image you wanted for your next real estate grift. William finally found his voice, though it lacked its usual booming authority. This is impossible. You couldn't have afforded this. You were just a junior analyst at a firm that laid you off. He looked toward the door, clearly hoping the bank's security team would come in and forcibly remove me, as if he were still standing in his own living room. You are hallucinating! Caroline cried out, reaching across the table to grab the papers, but David pulled them away before she could tear them. You are having a mental breakdown, Stella. You need help. We are calling a doctor, not signing any more of these ridiculous papers. Naomi's frantic gaze shot to Andre. Andre, do something, she shrieked. Tell them who we are. But Andre was no longer posturing. He was slumped in his chair, his skin an ashen, sickly gray, his eyes fixed on the federal agent who was now slowly, methodically closing the laptop he had been using. The realization that they were no longer dealing with a bank, but with the full crushing weight of federal law, was finally filtering through their dense layers of narcissism. Andre realized that the loan they were about to sign for was not going to be a deposit into their account, but a recorded confession of fraud presented to the federal government. The power shift was instantaneous. The arrogance that had fueled them for years evaporated, leaving behind a group of frightened, small-minded people who had been caught in a web of their own spin. William slumped back into his chair, looking every bit his age, the mask of the successful executive slipping to reveal a man who had truly lost everything. Caroline was no longer the Queen of Atherton. She was a woman facing the very real possibility of losing her home, her reputation, and perhaps even her freedom. Naomi's spite had been replaced by a vacant look of terror. I didn't feel triumph, not in the way I expected. I felt a cold, deep, and heavy sense of closure. I looked at William, who had spent decades telling me I was a failure because I didn't chase his definition of success. I looked at Caroline, who had spent years using me as an emotional punching bag to vent her own insecurities. And I looked at Naomi, who had spent her entire adult life trying to erase my existence. They hadn't just been family, they had been an active, sustained, and calculated drain on my spirit and my resources. I stood up slowly, the silence in the room heavy enough to feel. I adjusted my blazer, the material sharp and perfectly pressed. You want to talk about legacies, Dad? I asked, my eyes locking onto his. Your legacy is debt fraud and a daughter you drove away because she wasn't good enough. My legacy is the empire I built while you were busy trying to trick me. You wanted a business meeting today. You have it. But the terms have changed. You aren't closing a mortgage, you're settling your accounts. And we are going to start with everything you took and everything you lied about from the very first day you decided I was worth less than the house I bought to keep you off the street. The undercover agent signaled to his colleague, and the room prepared for the final turn of the screw. The sound of Andre's chair scraping against the floor was violent, a sharp, jarring screech that cut through the clinical silence of the bank conference room. He was already halfway to his feet, his face twisted into a mask of pure, frantic terror. He had finally connected the dots. The cold realization had hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't just been negotiating with a predatory lender. He had been actively, repeatedly, and verifiably submitting forged fraudulent documents to federal authorities under the guise of an entity that belonged to someone he had spent years trying to diminish. He took a lunging step toward the glass exit, his hands outstretched, as if he could physically push his way through the locked security doors. The loan officer, who had been sitting so quietly at the head of the table, didn't even flinch. He didn't raise his voice or reach for a weapon. He simply stood up with the kind of calm, terrifying efficiency that only comes from years of experience in federal law enforcement. He moved with a speed that defied his sedentary appearance. Before Andre could take a second step, the officer reached into his blazer and produced a polished silver FBI badge. It caught the harsh fluorescent light of the room shining with a finality that made the very air feel thinner. At the same moment, the heavy double doors at the rear of the suite burst open. 3 more agents in tactical windbreakers swarmed into the room, their movements synchronized and lethal. They fanned out with practiced ease, cutting off every potential exit and cornering the family members against the far wall. The absolute silence of the room was instantly replaced by a cacophony of shrieks and desperate protests. Naomi began to wail, a high, piercing sound that grated against the nerves. She clutched her expensive bag to her chest, her eyes darting between the agents and me as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. My mother, Caroline, retreated until her back hit the solid wood of the wainscoting, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She looked as though she might faint, her carefully maintained composure finally abandoned to the sheer raw terror of the moment. The lead agent stepped forward, his voice projected with the volume of a loudspeaker, effectively drowning out Naomi's hysterical sobbing. "Andre, you are being placed under arrest for federal wire fraud, institutional mortgage fraud, and aggravated identity theft. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The agent's partner moved in his hands, expertly pinning Andre's arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed in the small space, a sound so final that it seemed to vibrate through the walls. Andre stopped fighting the moment he felt the cold steel against his wrists. He collapsed, his knees hitting the floor with a dull thud, and he began to mutter incoherently about how this was all a mistake, how he had been misled, how he was just a businessman looking for an opportunity. The charges were read off with a clinical, soul-crushing rhythm. Wire fraud for the transmission of the falsified corporate documents across state lines to the shadow bank. Mortgage fraud for the attempt to encumber a property he did not own using fabricated legal standing. Identity theft for the unauthorized usage of my credentials to impersonate the officers of Apex Holdings. Each charge was like a nail being driven into the coffin of their fabricated lives. William remained frozen in his chair, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. He looked like a man who had seen his entire reality erased in a single heartbeat. The power, the prestige, the Atherton mansion, the country club's social status, all of it had been revealed as nothing more than a precarious, fraudulent house of cards. Naomi, meanwhile, had begun to turn on her own family. She was shouting at William, asking how he could have been so stupid, blaming her mother for encouraging the marriage, and hysterically insisting that she had no idea the house didn't belong to them. It was a pathetic, grasping display of cowardice that I watched with a chilling detachment. She had spent years mocking my struggles, and now she was weeping like a child because she faced the very real prospect of being linked to her husband's federal indictment. The room was absolute chaos. An agent was currently labeling the folders on the table as evidence, carefully bagging the forged loan application that had been signed in William's name. Another agent was collecting Naomi's phone and her bag, likely looking for evidence of the communication she had with Andre regarding the loan. Caroline was still pressed against the wall, her eyes wide and unblinking, her mouth moving in silent prayers or curses. It was impossible to tell which. She wasn't the matriarch of Atherton anymore. She was just a woman who had lived a lie for 5 years, and she was currently watching it burn to the ground. The agent who had initially arrested Andre turned his attention to William and Caroline. While they weren't the primary targets of the fraud charge, their active participation and their knowledge of the forgery would be under intense scrutiny. He informed them that they would be required to accompany the agents to the field office for questioning. They weren't being arrested yet, but they were certainly not free to go. The look of panic on their faces was identical to the terror I had felt at the airport 5 years ago, the realization that the people who were supposed to be in control were entirely powerless. I stood up, adjusting the hem of my suit jacket. I hadn't raised a hand, I hadn't yelled, and I hadn't used a single cent of the money they had tried to steal from me. I had simply stepped aside and let them run full speed into the gears of the federal justice system. I looked at Andre, who was staring up at me from his position on the floor, his face a mixture of disbelief and pure concentrated hatred. He knew now that the unemployed analyst was the woman who had orchestrated his downfall. He knew he had been outplayed by the very person he had spent the last 2 years insulting. I turned my back on them, walking toward the door with my legal team in tow. The sting had been successful beyond my wildest expectations. The house of cards was gone, and the people who lived in it were finally going to be held accountable for the reality they had tried so hard to deny. The heavy silence of the conference room was shattered by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of steel cuffs tightening around Andre's wrists. He didn't go down gracefully. As the federal agents forced him toward the mahogany table to secure him, he fought back with a frantic, desperate energy, his designer blazer bunching up around his shoulders. He was slammed against the polished wood, the impact rattling the crystal water glasses and the remaining folders of forged documents. The air was filled with his frantic, rambling pleas. "Naomi, call a lawyer," he barked, his face mashed against the grain of the expensive furniture. "Call the firm. Tell them it's a misunderstanding. Get me out of here." Naomi wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the doorway, her mind clearly racing to find a way to save her own skin. She didn't offer comfort or support. Instead, she spun around and pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at me. "This is all your fault," she shrieked, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated entitlement. "You are doing this because you are jealous. Drop the charges, Stella. Tell them it was just a family business disagreement. If you don't do this, you are going to be the reason our family is destroyed." She stepped toward me, her eyes wild, her composure completely shattered. She looked like a spoiled child being denied a toy, completely unable to grasp the magnitude of the criminal investigation now tearing her life apart. One of the FBI agents stepped between us, his posture imposing and his hand resting on his sidearm, though he didn't draw it. He stayed focused on the suspects, but his presence effectively stifled Naomi's advance. It was then that the agent's eyes flickered downward, catching the flash of light reflecting off Naomi's left wrist. He grabbed her arm with practiced speed, pulling it toward the light. The Rolex I had been forced to surrender on the night of my eviction was there, shimmering brazenly against her skin. It was a distinctive piece, a high-end limited edition model with a unique custom-engraved casing. The agent looked at the watch, then at Naomi, then at me. I stepped forward, pulling my phone from my pocket to display the digital record of the purchase. I had the original digital receipt, the certificate of authenticity, and the high-resolution photo I had taken of the serial number the day I bought it at the boutique in downtown San Francisco. "That watch belongs to me," I said, my voice cutting through the hysterical room like a blade. "It was stolen from me by the defendant Andre on the night of my eviction from the Atherton estate. The serial number is clearly documented in my private asset records." I handed my phone to the agent, who scanned the document. He verified the serial number on the Rolex against the digital record on my screen. The match was undeniable. Naomi turned a shade of sickly pale green. Her hands went limp at her sides. "No," she gasped, trying to jerk her arm away. "This was a gift. Andre bought this for me, for the baby. It's not stolen." The agent's expression didn't change. It was a cold, professional mask. "The serial number matches the theft report filed by the owner. You are currently in possession of stolen property, valued well over $10,000, which constitutes grand theft. Naomi, you are being detained as an accessory to federal fraud and for the possession of stolen goods." A second set of handcuffs was produced. Naomi began to scream a high, piercing sound that set the glass in the room to vibrating. She fought the agents, kicking and flailing, until they managed to secure her wrists behind her back. She looked utterly pathetic, a woman who had spent the last 24 hours bragging about her impending wealth now being dragged away for the crime of wearing stolen jewelry. My father William watched the scene unfold with his mouth agape. He looked like a man watching his entire legacy being dismantled item by item. He didn't move. He didn't try to stop them. He just stood there, his shoulders slumped, his eyes vacant. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that his influence, his name, and his money meant absolutely nothing to the federal agents. The law didn't care about his country club memberships or the reputation he had spent a lifetime polishing. It only cared about the forged documents and the stolen property sitting on that mahogany table. As they dragged Andre and Naomi toward the elevators, I didn't feel a surge of victory. I didn't feel like celebrating. I just felt a quiet, profound sense of justice being served in the most orderly way possible. Andre was still trying to shout legal jargon at the agents, but they ignored him, their focus entirely on the logistics of the arrest. Naomi was sobbing, a hollow, selfish sound that was entirely focused on her own inconvenience. I looked at my mother, Caroline, who had remained huddled against the wall. She looked like she had aged 20 years in the span of an hour. She stared at the empty handcuffs on the floor, then at me, but she didn't say a word. The arrogance that had fueled their abuse for years had finally been met with the cold, hard reality of criminal law. They had made their choices, and now they were facing the brutal consequences. I turned and walked toward the exit, my lawyers following me out, leaving the Atherton family to deal with the rubble they had created. The air in the conference room turned glacial as the reality of their situation finally settled upon them. Andre and Naomi were already being led away down the hallway, their voices echoing in a frantic, disjointed cacophony of denial. But my parents remained behind, tethered to the table by a crushing weight of realization. Caroline, usually the embodiment of stiff-backed, high-society perfection, had physically collapsed. She was on her knees on the sterile industrial carpet, her designer dress pooling around her hands clutching at the hem of my suit jacket. She looked up at me with eyes rimmed in red, the mask of the elite matriarch completely dissolved. "Stella. Please," she sobbed, her voice cracking with a desperation that was almost painful to witness. "We are family. We have had our disagreements, but family is forever. We can fix this. We can find a way to make this right. You don't have to do this to us. Please, I am begging you to show a little mercy." I stared down at her, not with anger, but with a total, absolute detachment. For 34 years, this woman had been the primary architect of my emotional misery. She had been the one to whisper that I was not enough, that I was a burden, and that my existence was an inconvenience to her pursuit of social perfection. I didn't offer a hand to help her up. I didn't lean in to comfort her. I simply looked at her with a steady, unblinking gaze that communicated the total end of our dynamic. "You chose to throw me out into the pouring rain," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying clearly through the room. "You watched me struggle while you lived in a house I paid for. You traded your daughter for a scammer and a lifestyle built on lies. There is no family left to save Caroline. There is only the debt you owe for the life you tried to steal." William stood over her, his hands trembling as he reached down to pull her up, but he stopped when he saw the look on my face. He recognized, perhaps for the first time, that the girl he used to ignore was gone, replaced by a woman who could not be negotiated with. "David." My lawyer didn't give them a moment to wallow in their performative grief. He pushed a final single sheet of paper across the dark wood of the table. It was the document that signaled the end of their era. It was a 24-hour notice to quit, a legally binding eviction mandate that would force them to vacate the Atherton estate by the following day. If they did not leave, the sheriff would be authorized to remove them and all their remaining personal property by force. William stared at the document as if it were a death warrant. "You cannot do this." William breathed, his voice hollow and devoid of any lingering authority. "This house is our life. We have lived here for 15 years. It is all we have left. I shook my head once, a gesture of finality. It was never your house, William. It was a property you occupied under the terms of a trust I funded. You have been living in a house I paid for since the day you went bankrupt. The fact that you spent the last 5 years believing otherwise is not a legal argument. It is a symptom of the arrogance that got you into this position in the first place. William picked up the document, his fingers shaking so badly the paper rattled. He looked at the bold black lettering, his eyes tracing the eviction clause. Caroline had finally pulled herself up, leaning heavily against the back of her chair. She looked at me, hoping to find some flicker of the daughter who had once sacrificed everything to buy them a few more months of safety, but she found nothing. I was no longer the daughter who could be shamed into submission. I was the landlord, the financier, and the one who had finally drawn the line in the sand. They were staring into the abyss of their own making. Without the Atherton address, without the funds I had provided, and without the social standing they had used to bully their neighbors and peers, they were nothing. They had no savings, no retirement, and no friends who cared enough to open their doors to them. They were facing the exact reality they had intended for me: homelessness, public humiliation, and the crushing weight of their own bad decisions. The irony was so sharp it almost felt like a physical sensation. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearly time for me to head to the airport for my flight back to Malibu. I didn't owe them a ride home. I didn't owe them a place to stay. I didn't owe them another minute of my time. I stood up, smoothing my suit jacket, and gave them one final lingering look. "The house is locked up," I said, checking my phone. "The moving company I hired will be at Atherton tomorrow morning at 8 sharp to clear out any remaining personal items. Anything left behind will be donated to the local charity thrift shop, just like you used to donate my clothes when I was a teenager." God. The silence that followed was total. Caroline didn't cry. William didn't shout. They simply sat there, crushed by the weight of a reality they had spent half a decade desperately trying to outrun. They knew that when they left that conference room, their lives as they understood them were finished. I walked out of the room, David and his legal team right behind me, and I didn't look back to see them crumbling in their chairs. I walked into the bright, busy lobby of the bank, took in the sight of the real world moving on without me, and felt the final absolute relief of being entirely, undeniably free. The Atherton chapter was closed. The era of the Blackwell delusions was over, and the future, my future, was just beginning. The morning sky over Atherton hung low, a heavy blanket of charcoal gray that threatened a downpour but never quite delivered. It was a miserable day for an ending fitting for a family that had spent years operating in the shadows of their own deceit. 2 local police officers stood on the wide, pristine porch of the Atherton mansion, their presence a glaring violation of the carefully curated atmosphere of extreme wealth my parents had cultivated for decades. They looked bored, their hands resting on their duty belts, waiting for the eviction order to be fulfilled so they could move on to the next minor civil disturbance of the day. Inside the mansion was no longer a palace of prestige. It was a scene of frantic, disorganized desperation. William and Caroline, stripped of every ounce of their former status, were scrambling to clear their possessions. Because they had absolutely no liquid assets and were currently facing criminal scrutiny, they couldn't afford professional movers. There were no white-gloved staff carrying heirloom china or organized boxes of books. Instead, they were reduced to the indignity of black, heavy-duty trash bags. William, his tailored suit jacket discarded, and his sleeves rolled up, dragged a garbage bag filled with his own clothing across the polished marble floor. The sound of the plastic sliding against the stone was harsh and jarring. Caroline was in the living room, weeping openly as she tried to shove decorative pillows and expensive porcelain knickknacks into a construction bag. Every time a ceramic item clattered against the plastic, she flinched, the sound of potential breakage acting as a final reminder of her loss. Their pride, which had always been the strongest shield they possessed, was now completely gone. They weren't fighting back anymore. They weren't arguing or plotting. They were just 2 old people terrified of what happened when the lights went out in a house they didn't own. The spectacle didn't go unnoticed. The neighbors' people who had been the target audience for my parents' constant tiresome bragging were outside on their own perfectly manicured lawns. They stood with their arms crossed, some holding coffee mugs, some just watching, with an expression of cold, detached curiosity. These were the people who had endured years of William bragging about the mansion's square footage and Caroline complaining about the quality of the neighborhood. Now they were getting a front row seat to the total collapse of the Blackwell facade. They didn't offer help. They didn't look away. They simply recorded the humiliation on their phones, likely already texting the neighborhood group chat to ensure everyone knew that the Blackwells were finally being cast out. I sat parked across the street in the back seat of a black Maybach, the tinted glass providing me with a perfect invisible vantage point. The interior of the car was silent, smelling of expensive leather and polished wood. I felt absolutely nothing but a hollow, cold satisfaction. I didn't feel sorry for them. I didn't feel the need to jump out and save them. They had spent 34 years convincing me I was the mistake in their lives, the disappointment that had to be hidden away or silenced to make room for their preferred narratives. Now the roles were reversed, and the truth was the only thing that remained. Caroline stumbled out of the front door, struggling under the weight of a particularly heavy trash bag. She tripped on the step, and her bag split open, spilling a collection of clothes and bathroom supplies across the porch. She didn't try to gather them. She just stood there, her hair unkempt and her face splotched with tears, looking completely defeated. She looked toward the street, her eyes scanning the row of parked cars, as if hoping for a miracle or a sympathetic face. The Maybach was parked just past the driveway, hidden enough to be unrecognizable until I chose to reveal myself. I pressed the small button on the armrest, the smooth electric motor guiding the window down just a few inches. The silence between us was profound. The sound of the police officer's muffled conversation and the distant hum of traffic felt worlds away from the two of us. Caroline looked directly at the car, her gaze locking onto my eyes through the tint of the glass. She stopped dead. The sight of me perfectly composed, sitting in a luxury vehicle, while her entire world lay in ruins at her feet, was the final confirmation of her defeat. I watched the realization wash over her that I was the one who had orchestrated this, that I was the one who had finally held them accountable for the years of emotional neglect. She began to weep, not the performative crocodile tears of a social manipulator, but the jagged, ugly sobs of a woman who had finally run out of options. She looked small, fragile, and utterly inconsequential. I didn't offer a nod. I didn't mouth a message. I didn't show the slightest flicker of pity. I simply watched her, ensuring she knew exactly who I was and what I had done. She knew. The light of recognition in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. I pressed the button again, the window sliding up with the quiet, expensive efficiency of a well-engineered machine. The glass sealed shut, creating a perfect soundproof barrier between her misery and my newfound freedom. I gave a sharp nod to my driver. The car glided away from the curb, moving slowly down the quiet street as the wrought iron gates of the Atherton mansion began to swing shut behind me, locking my parents out of the only home they had left. The gates clicked shut with a definitive metallic ring that sounded like the final period at the end of a long, painful chapter. As the mansion disappeared from my rearview mirror, I allowed myself one deep cleansing breath. The chapter was over. The stage was empty. The truth had finally been spoken, and I was finally free to write the rest of the book on my own terms. The gears of federal justice ground slowly, but they possessed a terrifying, inevitable momentum. Exactly 1 year after the frantic scene in the bank conference room, I sat in my Malibu office, catching up on the final reports provided by my legal team. The fallout had been as absolute as I had once imagined. Andre, stripped of his expensive velvet blazers and his borrowed charisma, had been found guilty on all counts of federal wire and mortgage fraud. The judge had been unimpressed by his attempts to shift the blame onto my father, particularly given the overwhelming digital evidence I had provided to the FBI. He was currently serving a 10-year sentence in a medium-security federal prison, his days of pretending to be a tech titan replaced by a drab uniform and the endless, crushing monotony of life behind bars. The irony was not lost on me. that the man who had preached about hustle and vision now spent his hours counting down the minutes in a concrete cell. Naomi's situation was a different kind of imprisonment, one that would likely last for the rest of her life. She had narrowly avoided a prison sentence by pleading out a decision that essentially left her without a defense when the full scope of her financial crimes was laid bare in court. Her credit score, once propped up by my secret infusions of cash, had plummeted into the abyss. With a criminal record for grand theft and no professional experience beyond organizing parties and shopping for designer goods, her options were non-existent. I knew from a private investigator's report that she was currently working a minimum wage shift at a strip mall retail store, a place where she had to stand on her feet for 8 hours a day under the fluorescent lights she once claimed to despise. She was buried under a mountain of debt, her husband's legal bills, and her own failed ventures, leaving her with nothing but a bitter, echoing resentment. She had once mocked my career, calling me a pathetic charity case, yet now she lived a life that made my past struggles look like a vacation. Then there were William and Caroline. Their fall from grace had been the most visceral, a public display of arrogance meeting its overdue match. They had been forced to vacate the Atherton mansion within the 24-hour window, leaving behind almost everything they owned because they couldn't afford to move it or store it. They currently occupied a cramped, moldy one-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city, an area defined by decaying infrastructure and neglected streetlights. Every time it rained, the ceiling in their bathroom leaked a constant dripping reminder of the luxury they had taken for granted and subsequently lost. The social collapse of the Blackwells had been immediate and permanent. Their country club memberships were revoked the moment the news of the federal fraud charges hit the morning papers. Their circle of wealthy friends, people who had only ever valued them for their perceived status and the prestige of the Atherton address, had blacklisted them entirely. My mother, who had once been the queen of her social circuit, now spent her days in that dismal apartment, surrounded by the few items she had managed to shove into trash bags during the eviction. She had no one to host, no one to impress, and no foundation board to give her a sense of artificial purpose. My father had aged 20 years and 12 months. The man who had once commanded rooms with his booming voice and confident stride was now reduced to a ghost of himself, spending his days in a cheap lawn chair on their small concrete balcony, staring at the gray skyline with eyes filled with bitter, hollow regrets. They had built a life predicated on the belief that they were better than everyone else, that their status was immutable, and that they could treat their own daughter with cruelty without ever paying a price. Now their reality was defined by survival scarcity and a profound permanent social isolation. Every time they passed a mirror, they saw the reflection of the people who had traded their daughter's life for a temporary party. Every time they checked their bank balance, they were reminded of the money they didn't have and the reputation they had scorched beyond repair. I watched a video update from the restoration company that had finally completed the renovation of the Atherton estate. It was barely recognizable. I had stripped away the gaudy gold trim and the pretentious decor. Caroline had insisted on opting for a clean, minimalist aesthetic that reflected my own taste rather than their desperate need for validation. It was no longer a house built on lies and stolen funding. It was my house, a property that stood as a monument to what could be built when you stop trying to please people who are incapable of loving you. The satisfaction I felt wasn't malicious, though I understood why some might label it that way. It was the satisfaction of balance being restored. They had played a game of social and financial chess, thinking they were the masters of the board, only to find they had been playing against someone who held all the pieces from the very beginning. They had wanted the aesthetic of success without the work and the dignity of a family without the empathy required to maintain it. They had gotten exactly what they deserved. The fallout hadn't destroyed me. Instead, it had cleared the field, allowing me to build an authentic life where my achievements were celebrated, my boundaries were respected, and my success was not something I had to hide in the shadows. They were living in the ruins of their own choices, and I was finally starting the life I had earned. The sun hung low over the Pacific, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and burning orange. Standing on the glass balcony of my Malibu home, I listened to the roar of the ocean beneath me, a sound that was both primal and remarkably soothing. The Atherton estate was gone sold to a property developer who had no knowledge of the lies, the fraud, or the pathetic family who had once occupied it. That mansion had been the final physical weight holding me to a narrative that was never mine to begin with. By liquidating that asset and reinvesting the millions directly back into the expansion of Apex Holdings, I had finally severed the last vestige of the life I had once been forced to maintain. There was no more tax bill to manage, no more utility invoices to settle, and no more upkeep for a history that served only to demean me. The money was now fuel for my own ambitions, a testament to what happens when you decide to invest in yourself, rather than in the preservation of an image that was rotting from the inside. I thought about the word family, that loaded sacred term society uses to guilt us into silence and submission. We are told from the moment we are born that we owe our blood relatives an infinite reservoir of patience, blind loyalty, and unconditional forgiveness. We are told that family is a fixed, non-negotiable institution. But my life had taught me the harsh, liberating truth. Respect is not an entitlement based on DNA, it is a currency. It is a value that must be earned through consistent action and mutual regard. Loyalty isn't a debt we pay for the privilege of existing. It is a bond that requires two people to show up when things are difficult. When my family threw me out into that storm, they thought they were stripping me of everything. They thought they were leaving me to shiver in the cold, forced to crawl back to them for scraps of approval. They were wrong. They hadn't broken me. They had simply handed me the match to burn their parasitic kingdom to the ground. Every failure they had accused me of, every bad choice they had mocked, had been the forging process that created the woman standing on this balcony. The rejection had been the crucible. It had stripped away the need for validation, the desire to be perfect, and the fear of being alone. Once those fears were eradicated, I became the most dangerous person I could possibly be, someone who no longer needed anything from them. I looked out at the horizon, watching the line where the water met the sky. It was perfectly level, steady, and vast, much like the new life I had constructed. I had built an empire not out of spite, but out of necessity. I had proven that an empire built on your own terms is the only one that truly stands the test of time. I turned around to face the camera, letting the soft glow of the evening light illuminate the room. It was time to speak directly to the people listening, the ones who were perhaps currently sitting in their own versions of the Atherton mansion, enduring their own versions of Caroline and William. I knew how hard it was to break the cycle. I knew how heavy the guilt could feel. I knew the voice in your head that whispered you were being dramatic or sensitive or ungrateful. I was here to tell you that the voice was a lie. You are not a burden. You are not a failure because you refuse to be a prop in someone else's performative life. You are a person, and your value is set by you, not by the people who consistently fail to recognize it. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to build your own empire? Did you ever get the chance to serve them a dose of reality when they least expected it? I want to hear your story. Every struggle, every boundary set, and every moment of liberation counts. Let me know your journey in the comments below, because sharing your truth is the first step toward building your own foundation. If you found value in my story, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more discussions on navigating the treacherous waters of family dynamics and finding the courage to prioritize your own soul. Remember, no one can make you feel small unless you give them the permission to do so. And never, under any circumstances, let anyone make you feel small in a house you built with your own two hands. The horizon is wide open, and the only person deciding which way you sail is you. Thank you for listening, and until next time, keep building your truth. The most profound lesson from Stella's journey is that true worth is entirely self-defined, not a reflection of how others perceive or treat us. For years, Stella allowed her family to dictate her value, defining her by her failed career and her inconvenient existence. She spent decades chasing the approval of people who were fundamentally incapable of offering genuine love or respect. Her mistake was believing that she needed to earn a seat at a table where she was never truly welcomed. The moment she stopped seeking their validation and began investing in her own autonomy, she didn't just find success, she found herself. This transformation teaches us that we often stay in toxic environments because we mistake familiarity for safety. We hold on to blood ties because we fear the loneliness of the alternative, forgetting that being mistreated by family is a deeper, more corrosive form of isolation than being alone. Stella's eventual triumph wasn't about the money or the mansion. It was about the moment she realized her independence was the ultimate security. She refused to let her family's narrative of her failure become her reality. By walking away, she didn't just save herself. She dismantled the parasitic power structure they had used to control her. We must realize that anyone who requires us to shrink our potential to fit into their version of reality is not a partner in our growth, but an obstacle. The power to build an empire, whether financial or emotional, only comes when we finally prioritize our own truth over the demands of those who would rather see us small and submissive. Do not let your past define your potential. Start today by setting one firm boundary that honors your worth instead of seeking someone else's approval.